Just a few housekeeping things to keep in mind before I have the pleasure of announcing Paige. This presentation will be recorded and will be available for y'all after the fact. And one other thing, make sure to get your passport stamped and fill it in for the raffle. The drum is right by registration. So now I get the pleasure of introducing Paige Glave. Paige Glave is a security engineer at Flowcast, focused on detection, engineering, and incident response. Previously a data security analyst, she's active in the cybersecurity community, promoting individual security awareness. Paige regularly blogs about cybersecurity and enjoys creating home and cloud labs to enhance her skills. So please join me in welcoming Paige.
Okay, do y'all feel like looking up or should I go down? Do you care? Okay, those of you who've ever seen me talk, I don't stand still, so I apologize in advance if I make you a little motion sick. So what we're talking about today is threat modeling, and I like obnoxious talk titles, so what I have here is a little less talk, a lot more action. How many of you have ever done a threat model that basically nothing happened afterwards? Yeah, this is like we name and shame ourselves doing this. So that we're going to work on getting away from that today. There we go. Well, I don't know if you did that or I did that. So a little bit more about who I am. Besides cybersecurity, I'm a gearhead. Computers, musical stuff. We won't discuss how many guitars I have because that's a sore spot in my house. I am an obsessive learner. Something catches my fancy and I'm likely to deep dive for hours on it. Which is great, except when you're chasing rabbits at work and you need to be a little bit more focused. And I am former SLED. Do I have any SLED people in here? K-12, local government. I feel your pain, guys. It's great. It's a great place to work. I encourage all of you to look at it and consider it as your next opportunity. But there are a lot of challenges, and I won't pretend like there aren't. So, there we go. All right, so if I say threat model, what do y'all say? What do you think? That you can say in a talk that's being recorded? Nothing. We have no thoughts. Go ahead. I may have used, I generally say thought exercise, but yeah. Go ahead. Yeah? Anything? That's at least like a productive thought. Anybody else? I have opinions about what threat models often turn into. Waste of time. Like, I don't like having a meeting that just makes us feel better about ourselves, and we're like, oh, we identified threats, and then we filed that somewhere to never look at it again. So it's waste time. It gets to be pointless, unactionable. Like, okay, so this team is going to threat model, but that team has to implement, and then that team has to approve it. So we made decisions and then nothing happened, so it feels pointless. Thought exercise, so the paper exercise thing. Theoretical, and the last one for me is talky, talky, talky. It's a bunch of people sitting around talking instead of taking action. And that's not fair. That's not really what threat modeling is, but I've had enough threat models kind of go in that direction that can be what it feels like. And I've seen the frustration from other people in the industry. I've seen enough blogs about it that it seems to be an ongoing problem. And kind of where this is all coming from is my personal frustration of, like, we can do this, we can do the threat models, we do the right things, but is it doing anything, or am I just making documentation for the sake of documentation? I'm going to find the sweet spot on this. All right, so what threat models can we use or do we use? Anybody use Stride? Yeah, that one's, I think, older than I am, so we like it. Pasta. Anybody use Pasta? I think some of these we just try to name after foods to make ourselves feel better. I need a pizza threat modeling. I think there is one. Octave. Has anybody even heard of Octave? If you need to do an org level threat model, this one is pretty good, and you can choose how deep you go. They have some decent surveys, it's open source, has a lot of benefits at the organizational level. Attack trees, decision trees, persona non grata, like we like making our little trading cards with bad actors on them. Or you just go get like the CrowdStrike cards and use those. Yeah, like we can have fun with it. There's a lot out there, there's a ton of different ways. But what I've struggled with a lot of these is they're all really focused either on software development or risk or something like that. They're not as focused as I want them to be on taking action. And that could be a personal problem. I will acknowledge that. But it's also a question of, is it doing what I want to? And then, who uses AI in their threat modeling? I have no qualms about saying that I use it. Does that mean that I take our sensitive documents and throw them up into ChatGPT and be like, what's the threat here? I like my job, so no, I don't do that. But it's not a bad thing to use, right? Do you trust what comes out of it? Okay, show of hands. Who trusts what comes out of ChatGPT without fact-checking it? Yeah, I figured nobody in here would raise their hand. It's way more fun to ask in a group of non-tech people and see how many are like, yeah, ChatGPT is always right. Like, no. No, don't. Or do you put proprietary information into ChatGPT? Well, define proprietary. It's like, oh God, I'm gonna die. But yeah, don't upload sensitive stuff to external systems. If you're running your own models and you've trained them and it's hosted on your stuff and it's not going external, maybe then you can, put all the information in there. But if not, general questions are fine. And I think that for us, whether you're a detection engineer, threat modeler, IR, whatever, you can't be a SME on everything, right? You're not gonna know everything about everything. So using AI of some sort to kind of fill in some gaps, give you a starting place, can come in handy. Still fact check it, make sure it makes sense, but it's a tool that you can use, and honestly probably should use because it can save you some time, and I am efficient, which means I'm lazy. And I try to be as lazy as possible with this stuff because threat modeling can suck up a ridiculous amount of your time, right? If any of y'all started a threat model and then you look up and you're like, wow, that was 5 hours, I'll never get back. It's easy to let it become a massive time suck. So what are our priorities? And I think if you look at this from a software development perspective or a detection perspective or an IR perspective, you get a little bit of differing priorities. And sometimes that can become a problem with the people in the room because you've got competing values and competing priorities coming up. So when we think about our objectives, as a security person, what are some of the objectives that you're wanting to get at? Scare the CEO. Like legit, sometimes that's an objective, right? Scare people into action. Y'all don't roll that way? All right, just me. That's fine. I have no problems with it. But you need to have an objective. What are you looking at? Are you looking at a system that's about to be implemented and trying to figure out if it's worth the risk? Are you looking at a system that somebody already purchased and implemented and you're trying to figure out how it's going to cause you to lose sleep? Think about what you're doing and why you're doing it. Come away with action items. That is one of the biggest problems I have with meetings. How many meetings have we been to that there's a lot of talking and no action items that come out? Threat modeling cannot be that unless you just really like pretending to work. And, no judgment here. But action items make this stuff more tolerable for everybody involved, and it's easier to justify the time spent when you're like, okay, we did the threat model, we came up with these action items. These are the concrete results from doing this. This is where we improved a control if you've got audit stuff. This is where we develop detections, whatever. The practicality piece, I'm always entertained when I talk to people at different places and they're like, well, we're really working on protecting ourselves from nation states. And I'm like, why exactly? I'm not saying you shouldn't, but why? Like some of y'all in here I'm not going to point at people or name names or ask for volunteers. Some of us need to be worried about nation-state actors, right? But for most of us, what's the biggest risk? If you're K-12, it's the kids. Let's be honest, it's the kids, and they are creative and they will get around stuff. If you are a small, medium business, what's probably your biggest threat? Biggest threat, ransomware. People who are looking for financial gain, right? Is it worth building out security to protect against a nation state if that's not really your threat? I mean, if you want to buy and play with toys, maybe, but that doesn't make a lot of business sense. The time thing is big because, I don't know, maybe you guys have nothing going on at work and you're just looking for stuff to do. So I would really like to know about your company. But we need to be as efficient as possible with it because our time is valuable. And a lot of threat models, you're pulling in stakeholders from across the company. You're pulling in VP, C-suite level people. Hopefully not a lot, but sometimes you have to. And you want to make sure that their time and yours is used well. And then the last one is the approach. Did any of the ones on the previous slide make sense to you? Does Stride make sense? If you're not a software company, does Stride make sense? Not particularly. If you're looking to threat model an entire company, pasta doesn't make sense, right? You really need to look at what you're doing and find what makes sense for you. So let's talk about the security priorities. These are going to be different from other stakeholders, but for us, these are the things that I think are important ideas. The biggest one, what can go wrong? Because that should define whether or not this is worth your time. If the worst thing that happens is really low reputational hit, is that someplace you probably need to be spending time? If it's something that could end your company, yeah, then it's worth the time. So think about where things can go wrong and how they can. How can we stop that from happening? Hopefully there are already mitigations in place, and how can we verify that? How many of you have worked on a threat model and you started listing your mitigations? You're like, well, we have this, this, and this in place. And as part of your threat model, like, okay, verify the mitigations. We know that we have a rule that anything getting deployed gets a public access block. And that is in our code in this way. After your threat model, do you verify that? I would say yes. When you're talking through these things, as you look at it, 2FA is required for every login. Is it really? How many of you have gotten around various security controls, don't raise your hands, at your company? Or, we do not let people copy paste things, but y'all, phones exist and they have cameras. So unless you're banning phones, copy paste is just slowing people down. So it's thinking about what the mitigations are and how you can actually verify that they're working. And are those effective enough? From a detection standpoint, one of the things that I am always looking at as we're going through threat models, how can I detect that? So the big starting point there is, does this thing have logs? Y'all, I swear, if I see one more security product that comes without user and admin logs, I might scream. That is starting to be my opening question anytime I talk to a vendor now. Does your product have thorough logs, and are they exportable in a way that it doesn't matter what SIM I'm using, or SIEM? Pick your flavor. If we don't have logs, if we don't have some way of detecting it, what's the point? Besides, we did this and we can point at it on a risk register and say, this is going to be a problem. And then do we have detections in place? And with that, you have to think a little bit creatively, because you may be looking at AWS, and there are plenty of things that need to go on there. But do you have detections in your identity provider that help protect AWS? How are you protecting them? How can you connect the dots? How can you use stuff that you have? Because managing detections gets old, right? How many of you can actually count the number of detections you have in place? Or other than like going and looking, and you're like, oh, it's triple digits now. Anybody think they've hit 4 digits on their detections? Like ones you've made, not just the built-in ones. It's pretty ridiculous. But we need them. And they need to be there. But what we should always look at as we're threat modeling is, what can we use that we already have? Is there something we can tweak? Is there something we can add to? Is there a system related that I can use to detect on this. All right, so the first part, what's being threat modeled? Fun question for happy hour, but not now, would be what's the weirdest thing you've ever threat modeled, right? Some of us that have physical locations, they can get weird. We have an oil rig out in the middle of nowhere with a chain link fence around it and cows. What's my threat model? It can get fun. A little different when you're looking at software versus SaaS versus VS Code extensions. Anybody looked at those lately? That's a nightmare waiting to happen. Or Chrome extensions. Yeah, it's a couple of Chrome extensions. So looking at what they have, and also when you're thinking about those certain things, also, do you want to do a threat model for a single Chrome extension? I don't. I will if I have to, because there are some that, you know, when just the right person is like, I want this extension, and you're like, well, based on our generic threat model, this risk is too high. And they're like, well, I want it anyways. That's when you do a specific threat model. But for extensions, things like that, try to do them as classes so you're not just driving yourself crazy. And make sure that what you're looking at makes sense at the level of granularity. We don't want to get into navel gazing. We don't want to get very myopic in what we're looking at. And it can be helpful to look at classes instead of specifics so that you can save time and focus where you need to focus. And adjust your base model as possible. And I'll talk more about that when we get to the MITRE piece at the end. All right, so who needs to be in the room? How many of y'all like going to meetings? No, nobody actually wants to admit they like going to meetings? All right, that's fair. The big thing here is the pre-work, the meeting, and then the post-work. And if you have this effective, you can minimize the amount of synchronous time that you need. And I find that really works better with a lot of people. We're a remote-first company, so operating this way gets me a lot more buy-in from engineers and DevOps than if I tried to do all of this in a single meeting. So our pre-work, we've got whoever your threat modeling SME is. Anybody have a dedicated threat modeling team? One day I'm going to ask that question and somebody's going to say yes. They do exist. There just aren't many of them. A system SME, so you're not going to know everything. Have somebody fill in the blanks for you, get a system diagram, do something, lean on them, and then somebody who can play the attacker role. I like to pretend like I can hack stuff, but it's not my forte, so that's why I bring in the people who do that, to look at things in different ways. And that combination of people helps you get into really what the problems are. In the meeting itself, I shoot for 5 or fewer. Have any of y'all seen that how much did this meeting cost extension that, I don't remember who built that. Keep that in mind, right? You may have additional people. I've had more junior team members sit in to take notes, to listen and learn, so they can start doing it themselves, leading threat models. But you don't want to have 20 people on a Zoom, and you can see how bored 19 of them are as you're going through things, right? So get the people that you need in the room. The rest, that's where your document review after the fact comes in. Where you're assigning tasks, or you may have sign-off on the doc, like you may have a stakeholder accept the document or accept the risk. That's where all the people who might have wanted to come to the threat meeting, but it wasn't really worth their time, get to have input there. So you can revise and edit after the fact. All right, so the pre-work. This is the stuff that we don't want to do at the same time because it takes too long and we would be bored. So what's the business objectives? Why are we doing this? What's it supposed to do? Does it actually do this? How many, this is probably also not a hand-raising question, had somebody buy something and they're like, this is going to solve this problem for us. And then when you look at it, you're like, why did you think this would solve this problem? So make sure that what you're looking at, what's the business objective? Is it doing that? If it's not doing that, can you get rid of it? Probably not, but we like to think we can. What are the integrations? I've seen some scary integrations that it's like, oh, it's integrated with SharePoint. But to integrate it with SharePoint, you have to give it like God permissions. and that's frowned upon. Please don't do that. Does it open a clear path to stuff? You know, where can you get to from it? These are the things that we think about. Diagrams are great. Hopefully, wherever you are, you have some sort of data classification in place. And people know what it is and can actually pinpoint what category data goes into. If all you're dealing with is, you know, white data that is public, is it that big of a concern? Is it worth a threat model? Is that something you need to spend time on? Versus, is it red data that, you know, goodbye company if this gets exposed? That's going to impact how you choose to approach this. And then link to your documentation. The number of times in my life I have seen somebody copy over documentation or create documentation when there's a living document somewhere that has all that is insane. This is another place to be lazy. Link to the documentation. Don't copy paste it over, because then you're going to just be doing that every time they make an update. And I don't have the time or patience for that. And I doubt most of y'all do either. So then we get to the high-level threat modeling, because those system questions inform what we do with the high-level stuff. When it comes to these questions, this is like your gut reaction, right? When I look at this system, what is the thing that is going to make me cry the most? Or what's the thing that's going to keep me up the most at night? Is this something that if it gets breached, all of our customers are going to leave us? If this gets breached, are our employees exposed? What's the damage? Is this something that anybody in my company now has access to that has sensitive client information in it? Are we doing things to make sure people aren't disgruntled and being insider threats? How could they use this data? Is there any logging in place that prevents them from using it? What can we do about it? And initial areas of concern. So this is just off the top of your head. What are the problems? What are the issues that you see? If you have a system, so you have somebody maybe on the help desk that has access to a system with a ton of customer data, and they are just the nicest, sweetest thing ever. That is something that is a risk. Because while you love that from a customer service perspective, what can happen to that help desk person? Yeah, social engineering, which you don't want them to start being mean, but it's something you need to be aware of and teach them to ask questions and work on that. And that's a very real thing that can get brought up with some of these. Like, oh, we have all of these mitigations in place. Have you talked to people about who should be asking them about this data or things like that? So that's the high level stuff. Just your gut check. Don't spend a ton of time on it, but it's something you don't want to rush through, but it's also something that you don't want to just get completely stuck in the weeds on. Then the next thing, there we go. I like to have these additional sections in the documentation. Okay, y'all, I'm massive on document templates. And part of it is to keep me on track, and part of it is to standardize it so other people can do it without help. So I keep these additional sections to make it easy. If I have a second detection and response person in the room, I will have them stay in the notes area and just jot stuff down as it goes while I'm staying in the main document where we're at and putting things in. Great learning opportunity, and often captures stuff that you don't see otherwise. Action items gets its own section. Link it to your ticketing system. Make sure that you put enough details in these action items that when you look at it in 6 months, you know what you were talking about. I'm sure I'm the only one who's ever done this, but going through things and you're like, we need to figure out this, and then you go look at it a month later and you're like, would have been great if I'd put what this is when I made this note in the first place. So make sure you put details in there. If you've got a detection request template or you've got ticket templates, for goodness sakes, use those so you don't hate yourself in the future. On the detection side, make sure you document what existing detections apply to this and how they apply. Like, it's great to list it, but sometimes if it's on a different system or a related system, without noting why that matters, when you go back and look at it, same thing, you won't understand where, like, why did I put this Okta detection in this AWS threat model? You need to have the details there to remember. And then on your needed one, this is another place to use. Okay, legit question. How many of y'all have a detection request template? Super helpful if you don't have one, even if you just use it internally, because I make a lot of detection tickets, and if I make it for myself and don't put the details in there, it's really not that bad because generally I've made notes somewhere. But if somebody else on my team picks it up, if I don't have good notes, if I don't have the template information in there, they're now blocked trying to read my mind, which is something nobody wants to do. So put in the details so other people can pick it up when they're ready. And then a hardening review is often going to go to IT. It may go to DevOps or engineering. What needs done to make sure things are in place, functional, and what else do we need to do with it? Then we get to the time suck. The MITRE breakdown. Incredibly valuable. Do not, for anything, do this in a meeting. The people in the meeting, unless they are other detection engineers or IR people or, I don't know, glutton for punishment, will hate you if you go through the MITRE template tactic by tactic by tactic. We may find that fun, but it's not fun for other people. Do this beforehand. Pick the model that makes the most sense. The new LLM model has been really helpful to narrow scope on that. Use a SaaS model if it's a SaaS product. If it's enterprise and you need to go more holistic, go more holistic. Use a rating system that makes sense. Where I've found the MITRE breakdown really helpful is sometimes when we go through that gut check and we think about how you can use a system, you miss things, right? Because we tend to get set in our ways. We think about how we would attack things. And I found going through the MITRE framework in whatever variety you end up using, it forces you to think a little bit differently. And it's another way of getting another head in the room without actually making somebody else spend time on it. It does take time. I will not lie. I often have to go back into MITRE and look at the tactic because I've forgotten what the more esoteric ones are. But it's really beneficial as you're working on systems, especially if you're not as familiar with them, to have a guide of things to look and check through. So it takes time, but it's worth it. Then we get to the meeting. We've already established we don't like being in meetings. The way that we do this, we have the minimal staff in the room. Occasionally we have extras, but generally we've got 3 to 5 people so that it's not a time or money suck. 50-minute meetings. I believe in shortened meetings, so if I have a 30-minute meeting, it's 25. If I have an hour-long meeting, it's 50. Your coworkers will love you when they discover that, because instead of going back-to-back meetings, they get a breather. Hugely helpful, especially when you're working with people outside of your department, because a lot of people have more meetings than we do. And when you're in meetings all day, that 5 to 10 minutes to breathe between is massive. The first 10 minutes are review, because while I would like to believe that everybody has read the threat model and is prepared to talk about it when they come to the meeting, I mean, y'all always do your homework, right? Yeah, nobody does their homework. But we do 10-minute review at the first. It's ish. So being remote, we go Zoom, cameras off, review the document, turn your camera back on when you're ready. Anytime you have a meeting with an agenda or something that needs read, that helps a lot. Usually it takes people about 5 to 7, but I allocate 10 just in case we need the extra time. And it makes the conversation significantly better. Having people take a look at it, even if they've been reviewing it, keeps it fresh in your mind and makes the whole process a little bit more streamlined because they're not trying to remember what was when. Then you've got about 30 minutes of discussion. If you're leading this, you need to be prepared. You need to have some ideas of what additional things you need to talk about, and that'll go in kind of your overview and things like that. And then leave 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes for review. The important part of that is so you can capture your action items, because otherwise you end up at 2 minutes to go and you're trying to scramble to write down action items and having to ask people to stay, and you don't want that. If you find, I did not touch that. If you find the meeting is not done, then you can make another one. I personally try to avoid having a second meeting. because we had one. If we've done the pre-work, we shouldn't have to have a second. But occasionally I will have a second meeting, or we will have a second meeting when something significant changes on the system. And then when you have to review or update your threat model, it goes very quickly. All right, so how do you make it worth it? Making it not just a paper or thought exercise or something to make compliance happy. I'm sorry if we have GRC people in there. I mean that in a nice way. You want to capture your action items as you go, which should be at minimum these 3 things: something for hardening, detections, and things to check. Add your notes as you go. Create your tickets. We usually leave that to whoever the DART person is, the detection and response person. It's their job to make the tickets, capture the details, and assign them at least to the team who's responsible. That way you don't have to assign it to a person, but you know it actually got done, and you can link those either to the threat model, if that makes sense in your documentation, or to an overall epic dealing with the system, and then revisit as needed. That can be, does anybody really want to redo a threat model every year? No, right? It's like passwords. We want to change them when we need to, not because it's just some arbitrary timeline. When major things change, if there's a breach at the company, that might be a reason to, a breach at that company of the system, not of your company, of course. We don't get breached. But when something happens, that's when to review it, and not just review to review, unless it's something that you look at from a business perspective and the criticality is such that, yes, we do want to revisit this on an annual basis because things change, and we would really, really strongly prefer that this not go up in flames. That can be kind of important. And then the last thing, I've got a couple resources on here about the threat modeling, one from Red Canary, and then the MITRE matrix. These are kind of reference points that I looked at with that. There was a blog recently that came out about using AI in threat modeling that I'll add to the slides when I post it on my blog. This stuff will be posted shortly, probably next week, because it's the end of the quarter, and if you have quarterly stuff, you know what that means. All right, so any questions about threat modeling with a purpose to do stuff, or it's after lunch and you're all comatose?
Hold on a second, I'll bring this over to you.
So how do you get buy-in from people who actually have the decision-making power to do threat modeling?
So if you're nice, you kind of ask permission and build the business case and, do things like that. As an IC who was kind of just told, like, we need threat modeling, I kind of took that as an invitation to make threat modeling what I thought it needed to be and to try to drive value with it. I think the biggest thing that I've done to get buy-in is the action items, because we can tangibly show, okay, we thought this system was fine. When we looked at it, this is what we found. This is what came out of it. These are the changes. This is the decrease in risk and things like that. Trying it helps. If you can't get the time in on it, like if it's a manpower, person power issue, pick something and do it. Point to other places. I think, you could use the Snowflake stuff that's been recent as an example of that, because Snowflake did not get breached. People's accounts on Snowflake got breached. But if you use Snowflake, all the news on that can give you some power to get that threat model done, even though really you know what happened. But it can be a way to say, look, Snowflake's in the news a lot. Our Snowflake instance is likely being targeted. Let's take a look and make sure that we can threat model and understand what the risk is. Use the FUD. I'm a fan of that. It's going to be there whether you like it or not, so you might as well use it to your benefit. No idea if that'll work for you, but that's kind of how I approach things.
Any other questions?
No. Everybody needs more caffeine. I need more caffeine, I'm not going to lie. All right, well, thank you. Appreciate it. It's great to see everybody out here again. This conference has gotten ridiculously big. And that's where to find me. Feel free to reach out on LinkedIn or wherever if you've got questions.